Masechet Nazir Daf Lamed Gimel. This daf is very special because it is the shortest daf in all of the Talmud. Only 38 words. All those 38 words are on Amud Aleph because Amud Bet has 0 words of Gemara. It's all Tosafot. All right. So we'll have some extra time, and let's take this opportunity to restudy this Mishnah, which is on Lamed Bet, Amud Bet, as an example of Pshuto Shel Mishnah. We all know about Pshuto Shel Mikra, where there are many cases, almost every pasuk in the Torah, where there's a midrash that says one thing, and the Pashtanim come and say, oh, this is according to the midrash, however, the Peshat is otherwise. And so we can read the Chumash on multiple levels and understand it as according to the midrash, or we could say, listen, the words should mean exactly, precisely what they say, and thereby read a more literal or contextual understanding of Mikra. All right, so anyone who's familiar with Rashi, Rashbam, Ibn Ezra, all the classical Mefarshim recognize that there are multiple levels of studying Tanakh. What we're going to see here is that this is true of Mishnah as well. Although the cases are not as ubiquitous, and most of the time the Gemara is explaining the Mishnah in a pretty straightforward manner, but there are some cases where that's not so. And already the Rishonim point that out. So we're going to study this Mishnah. We will see a couple of difficulties in the language of the Mishnah. The Gemara here will offer 2 explanations, and then we will go over to Harambam, who gives a different, alternate explanation of this Mishnah. And so this will be a great example of Pshuto Shel Mishnah. I should note there's a great book called Pshuto Shel Mishnah by Hanan Gafni. So check that out, and he describes this phenomenon in great detail, including what all the Rishonim and Acharonim say about it. All right, here we go. Mishnah that we've already encountered. Hayu mehalechin baderech. Ve'echad ba kinegdan ve'amar echad mehem hareni nazir shezeh peloni. There are 6 people that are walking on the road. And down the road, they see someone else coming towards them. And one of the 6 people, call him Mr. A, says, I will be a Nazir if that is Peloni. Call him Shimon. Okay, I'll be a Nazir if that is Shimon. Now, this already, we have a question. Why would he say, I'll be a Nazir if it is Shimon? Does he think that it is Shimon or that it's not Shimon? If we just read it in a straightforward way, it sounds like he recognizes him first. Says, oh, that's Shimon. I'm a Nazir if that's Shimon. Now, this is weird because to be a Nazir is a very tall undertaking. Right? This requires a lot of effort, a lot of refraining from various things and bringing korbanot at the end. You'd think if someone was taking a bet, they would be the opposite, right? If I'm wrong, then I'll be a Nazir. And here it sounds like he's saying, if I'm right, I'll be a Nazir. All right, hold on to that thought. Rambam is going to answer it. But right now, let's assume that he's saying, I will be a Nazir if that's Peloni, because I think it is Peloni. Whereas the second person, Mr. B, says, V'echad amar hanei Nazir she'en ze Peloni. B said, I don't think that's Shimon. And you know what? I'll be a Nazir if it's not Shimon, right? If I'm right, it's not Shimon, then I'll be a Nazir. Again, same question, right? Shouldn't it be the opposite? And Rambam will explain it the other way around. Now, Hareni Nazir she'ehad mikem Nazir. Mr. C, hearing his first 2 friends say that, says, I'll be a Nazir if one of you is a Nazir. So just in terms of logic, it sounds like he's definitely a Nazir because, either that is Shimon or it's not Shimon. So either A is or B is a Nazir, which would sound like logically C will certainly be a Nazir. Now D hears that and says, I'll be a Nazir if neither of you first 2 guys are Nazirim, A and B. So in terms of the logic here, since either A or B are a Nazir, so D sounds like he would not be a Nazir. All right, so Shishanechem Nazirim. Now, A, B, C, D, E says, I'll be a Nazir if you 2 previous guys or it could be referring to A and B, are both Nazirim. So now we have all logical possibilities, right? C said one of you, D said none of you, E said both of you, right? All referring to A and B, whatever their status is as Nazirim. And finally, the last friend, Mr. F, says, Shekulchem Nazirim, I'll be a Nazir if all 5 of you are Nazirim. All right, now if we go strictly just with logic, right, and this turns out that it is Shimon, that means A would be a Nazir, not B. C would be a Nazir, because he said if one of you is a Nazir. So we have A and C are Nazirim, and D is not, because it's not 0. E is not, because it's not both of them. And F also would not be, because some of the ones before are not. So in terms of strict logic, only A and C should be Nazirim if that is in fact Shimon. All right, so this would seem to be like a straightforward kind of logic game, but in fact, we're going to see 3 different opinions. Bet Shammai Omerim, Kulan Nazirim. Bet Shammai says all of them are Nazirim. Now, why? Why would they be a Nazir, even if it turns out that they were wrong about this identification? This is because Bet Shammai, as we saw already, says that consecration in error is a valid consecration, right? Just like before, the thing that comes out first, the black one that comes out first will be Hekdesh, and the white one comes out. Hekdesh Ta'ut is Hekdesh. Bet Shammai says the same thing about a Nazir. Someone who declares himself a Nazir, thinking that, hey, this person, this is going to be true. So even if it turns out to be wrong, as if he said, I'm a Nazir, thinking something, even in error, he is a Nazir. So that explains Bet Shammai. Now, Bet Hillel Omrim, Eno Nazir ela mi shelo nitkayemu devarav. Bet Shammai says, there's a double negative here. One is not a Nazir except for one whose condition has not been fulfilled. Did I say that right? One is not a Nazir except. Let's translate that to one is a Nazir, right? If his words were not fulfilled. Now, this doesn't make sense. It should be the opposite. It would say, Bet Hillel should be saying, the word should say, if his words were fulfilled, meaning if his condition was fulfilled, then he is a Nazir. His condition is, this is Shimon. So if that's true, and it is Shimon, his words are fulfilled, then he is a Nazir. It is a little strange that Hillel seems to be saying, right, too many negatives here. Why was he saying, if it's not fulfilled, then he is a Nazir? Shouldn't be. So this is what the Gemara is going to ask, and Gemara will give 2 explanations for it, and Rambam is going to give a third. All right. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, and Ehad Mehem Nazir. Rabbi Tarfon said none of them are Nazirim. That's because, according to the Rabbi Tarfon, you're only a Nazir if you are certain when you make the vow that you are going to be a Nazir. Right? It only works if you're certain. If you have any doubt at the time that you say it, whether you actually will be a Nazir, doesn't work. And we're going to see the pasuk that Rabbi Tarfon learns this from. All right, good. So even though we have this, interesting logic of all these 6 different cases and permutations, I think it's here, all these different cases are there to show us the extent of the range of views. Bet Shammai saying they're always Nazirim, right? Even if their conditions were not fulfilled, and the last person for some reason thought that they're all Nazirim. Turns out they're not all Nazirim, but he thought that they were. When he said the vow. So even though he was in error, and we point out to him afterwards, oh, listen, you made some logic mistakes, you made some reality mistakes, it doesn't matter. Because he said, I am a Nazir, even though he said if, but he thought that those were true, so they are all Nazirim. Rabbi Tarfon said none of them are Nazirim, right? Even the ones that sound like they should be, because you're only a Nazir if you're sure. And Bet Hillel says, just follow the logical track. And that would be, in our case, if it is Shimon, A and C are Nazirim and not the rest. All right, Mishnah continues. Hirtiya la'achorav eno Nazir. Shimon turns around and walks back the other way. And we don't know who it is. If the guy who's coming towards us, we don't know if it's Shimon or not. He sees these 6 people. I guess they're all, pointing and talking to him. And so he says, I better get out of here. And he goes the other way. We never find out who it was. So now we have these 6 people whose vows of Nazirut all depend on whether that is Shimon or not, and now we can never know. So we have a case of doubt. What should we do in a case of doubt? Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yomar im maya kidvarai, hareni nazir chova, v'im lav, hareni nazir nedava. Okay, the first opinion, Tanakama here, says, Eno nazir, hiter lacharav, eno nazir. If he went back the other way, then none of them are Nazirim. A said, I'll be a Nazir if that is Shimon. He never finds out if it's Shimon, so he's out. B said, I'll be a Nazir if it's not Shimon. He never found out the answer, so both of them are in doubt. So whoever says a no Nazir thinks that when you make a Nazir in doubt, then you're off the hook. Okay, the Gemara is going to first propose that this is the same opinion as Rabbi Tarfon. But that would kind of be redundant because Rabbi Tarfon says they're not Nazirim even if you know who the guy is. So what would this add? That if he walks away, it must be someone besides Rabbi Tarfon, right? It must be someone who's in the line of following Bet Hillel, who says, well, yes, if you identify him positively, then that person is a Nazir. If you can't identify him and you don't know, then it's not a Nazir. So we're going to have to identify who this is. There is another opinion here, that of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, listen, if you're in doubt, you have to be mahmir about it, because maybe it was Shimon all along, and you said, if it's Rabbi Shimon, I'm a Nazir. So you know what you should do? Here's good advice. Make a condition and say, if what I said was true and that was Shimon, then I'll be a Nazir as an obligation for that vow, the conditional vow I just made. And if it turns out that was not Shimon, then I'm going to be a Nazir voluntarily. I'll make myself a Nazir right now. So that way he's a Nazir either way, and he covers his bases, whether that was Shimon or it was not Shimon. That's the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, to be machmir in cases of doubt. All right, that's the Mishnah. And now the Gemara asks the question about the language of Bet Hillel. Mishe lo nitkaimu devarav, amai have nazir. Why does Bet Hillel say if his condition was not fulfilled, right, it was false, then he is a Nazir? Why should it be a Nazir if his condition turns out to be false? It should only be if it's true. So we have something wrong here. Answer number 1. Amar Rav Yehuda, ema mishinit kayimu devarav. Rav Yehuda says, oh, you have to reword the Mishnah. You transmitted it wrong. You memorized it wrong. Here's how you should teach it. Whoever's words were fulfilled, if his condition was fulfilled, then he is a Nazir, right? If it turns out it was Shimon, then he's a Nazir. That's the correct wording of Bet Hillel. Maybe the memorizers got mixed up with the double negatives, and that's the proper reading. All right, that's Rav Yehuda. Now it works, except that you have to change the words of, and why would the how did it get memorized and transmitted for the wrong way? So Abaye says, leave the words as they are. I can explain it. Abaye amar kegon de amar iname lav pelonihu heve nazir umay lo nitkaimu devarav lo nitkaimu devarav harishonim ela devarav haacharonim. Abaye gives a difficult ukimta. All right, he has to add a whole assumption here that the Mishnah is talking about a case where first he said, I'll be a Nazir if that is Shimon. And then he added another phrase and said, you know what? I'll also be a Nazir if it is not Shimon, right? Even if it's not Shimon, I'll be a Nazir. It could be maybe he's changed his mind in the middle, right? He says, I'll be a Nazir if that's Shimon. And then he's like kind of, thinking more carefully, looking more carefully. He says, you know what? I'll be a Nazir if it's not Shimon. So either he's changing his mind or he says, I'm going to take it upon myself. Either way, he adds another condition, an opposing condition, which in the end means, right, he is or not, I'll be a Nazir. So now we still have to figure out the language. Why did Bet Shammai then say if his words were not fulfilled? So what it means is his first words were not fulfilled, but rather only the second. Okay, so Abaye says, I'm going to explain this Mishnah talking about where he added another phrase, an added condition, which is the opposite of the first condition. And when he says not fulfilled, it means the first condition was not fulfilled, the second condition, but instead the second condition was fulfilled, and that's why he is a Nazir. So he said, I'll be a Nazir if that is Shimon. it's actually not Shimon, but he added, I'll be a Nazir if it's not Shimon, and so his first words were not fulfilled, but his second words were fulfilled. All right, you can see that this is adding a whole phrase. This is more difficult than Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda just took out one word. To take out the not and make it if his words were fulfilled. Abaye, keeps in the not, but ends up having to assume that the person making the vow added a whole nother phrase, which would be necessary to tell us to understand the Mishnah, and it's not in the Mishnah. Okay, so you see that both of these have to change the wording of the Mishnah and don't seem to be the simple Peshat reading of the Mishnah. And when we come to Harambam, he amazingly is very helpful in explaining both of these problems. Okay, regarding Bet Hillel, in Rambam in the Perush on the Mishnah explains as follows: "Ubet Hillel omrim shezeh shelo nitkayem midevarav davar hapotro min hanezirut hu shechayav benezirut." Okay, when it says that his words were not fulfilled, it doesn't mean his condition turned out to be false. It means a matter that would make him not liable to Nazirut was not fulfilled. In other words, he says, I'll be a Nazir if that is Shimon. So in order for him to get out of being a Nazir, it needs to be not Shimon. And so that matter, it's not the words that he said, but rather the reality, right? The bet, basically saying if he loses the bet, then he is a Nazir. Okay, this explanation goes hand in hand with the way Rambam reads the case in its entirety. And here we have to look at Mishnah Torah, in which he codifies the case, but he summarizes it, obviously quoting this Mishnah, but you see how he adds to the background in a way that we'd have to know. Now, Shenayim shayu malachin baderech v'ro echad uba kenegdan. First of all, Rambam simplifies the case because you don't need really all six to prove your point. So he says there's two people walking on the road, and one comes on from the other direction. V'amar echad min hashenayim zeh haolech kenegdenu Shimon hu. And the first one, Mr. A, says, I think that's Shimon who's walking towards us. He didn't vow. He just says, I think that's Shimon. Whereas Mr. B, his friend, says, no, I think that's Reuven. Now that they disagree, they want to make a bet, right? And they're going to commit themselves to their view. A hears that B, what B said. B said, I think it's Reuven. A hears that and said, no way it's Reuven. I'll be a Nazir if you're right, and that's Reuven. So you see, Rambam here fixed it, right? You're making a bet saying, I'll be a Nazir. If I'm wrong, right? If I'm wrong and you're right, and that's Reuven, I'll be a Nazir. But I know it's Shimon, so I won't have to be a Nazir. That's why he's making a bet like that. Now the second guy hears that and says the opposite. V'amar ha'acher hadeni Nazir im hiyesh Shimon. Mr. B says, I am so sure it's Reuven, and you're wrong that it's Shimon. I'm willing to take upon myself a bet. I'll be a Nazir if it's Shimon and you're right. So you have Rambam just added to the background and of that they are making a bet here. And I think this is a more simple reading of the Mishnah, and it fits right into the words of the Mishnah, as we can go back here and see. Rambam notices that it doesn't say Hadeni Nazir im ze Peloni. He actually doesn't make a condition that it is Peloni. Rambam sees that it says She ze Ploni, and this is how he understands it. I am a Nazir. I'll take upon myself a bet of Nazirut that I am so sure it is Peloni. That's another way of saying I'll be a Nazir if it's not Peloni, right? I'll be a Nazir if it's not Peloni. That's how I am how sure I am that it is Peloni. Okay, Rambam in Mishnah Torah reframes it because he wants to make it clearer, so he changes the language into a condition. But if we go back to the Perush ala Mishnah, we can see how he explains it precisely as follows: Im amar hareni Nazir she'en ze Peloni. Venimsa shehu oto Peloni. He says, I'll be a Nazir that this person is not Peloni. So he thinks that it's not Peloni, I'm willing to bet a Nazirut that I'll be a Nazir, right? I'm so sure that it's not Peloni. Now it turns out that it is that person, and he's wrong. So lo sheno nitkaimu devarav. His view, right, his assumption was wrong. That's why he is chayav, right? So that's how Rambam fits his interpretation directly into Bet Hillel's words. And this sounds like this is the Peshat of Bet Hillel's words. Not that he said a condition, but rather his assumption is what he's saying, right? Had any Nazir, well, this would be Mr. B, right? Had any Nazir, she en ze peloni. I'm a Nazir based on a bet that this is not Peloni. That's another way of saying that I'll be a Nazir only if it is Peloni, because I'm so sure it's not, right? So his words were Enze Peloni. Enze Peloni is what he thinks is true, but the condition is the opposite, right? If my assumption is wrong, then I'll be a Nazir. Okay, so it's pretty subtle. But once you see it, I think it seems obvious because it's very subtle and not the usual way that people talk. So that's why Rambam in his Mishnah Torah rephrased the Mishnah and just focused on the two first people because you get the point from there, and he reframed it into an if. To make it clearer, but in the Perusha Mishnah, he explains the words as is without having to add any more words or change anything in the Mishnah. Okay, this is quite brilliant on the part of Rambam. Rambam, of course, knew the Gemara and knew the two opinions in the Gemara, but nevertheless says, I'm going to explain the Peshat. Now, the commentaries on Rambam, like Mishneh Lamelech, wonder about this and say, Mekom makom hadavar tamua asli sheyefaresh Rabenu perush b'Mishnah hefech hatamud afte lo nafka mina mideh le'inyan dina. Says this is wondrous to me that Rabbeinu Harambam in the commentary on the Mishnah explains the Mishnah in the opposite way that the Talmud does, even though there's no practical difference in terms of halacha. Nevertheless, if there's going to be practical difference, then for sure, how could Rambam do that? But even if there's no practical difference, Rambam, how could you ignore the commentary of the Mishnah and come up with your own Peshat commentary? And he says, well, look at Tosafot Yom Tov. So let's look at Tosafot Yom Tov. And he first here explains the Rambam's commentary. He quotes Rambam, and Tosafot Yom Tov makes a play on words and says, Nitkaimu devarav. Rambam's explanation is good. And even though in our Talmud it does not explain it in that way, it doesn't matter for halacha. Okay, I was not going to go against the Gemara for halacha, but as a commentary on the Mishnah, he could say, listen, I think there's a simpler reading. Hareshut netuna lefaresh she'en ani ro'eh hefresh ben perush HaMishnah leperush HaMikra she'hareshut netuna lefaresh b'mikraot kasher enenu haro'ot chiborei perushim shemimot haGemara. And here is a fantastic statement. You have to quote this and remember it. He says, I don't see any difference between commentary on the Mishnah and commentary on Tanakh. That everyone has the right to explain Pesukim as we see fit, as we see from all the commentaries from the time of the Gemara. They'll say, oh, that's a Midrash, here's another commentary, right? Everybody explains Pesukim. Not, of course, in a way that will change halacha, but you can say this is the Peshat, even though the halacha follows a different understanding of the Pasuk. So as long as it doesn't go against any legal conclusion of the Gemara, so one can look at a Mishnah and say, oh, I think that is not the Peshat. And in fact, the Netziv goes even a step further and says, Derech HaGemara la'akem perush HaMishnah kedeh l'ukma halacha. That this is the way of the Gemara, that sometimes it will change or divert the explanation of the Mishnah in order to make it accord with the halacha. In other words, the Gemara thinks that halacha should be B, even though the simple reading of the Mishnah is A, and so they purposely reinterpret the Mishnah that says A to mean B. And the Siv notices things like that, and so he'll point out, really the Mishnah means A. But the halacha follows the interpretation of the non-peshat interpretation of the Mishnah, which is what it says in the Gemara. All right, so this is an essential principle whenever we are studying Mishnah, to know that sometimes the peshat is not the same as the Talmud's interpretation of the Mishnah, and this can be very helpful in many cases. All right, and now last part of this Mishnah, Hirtiya lachorav eno nazir. Talmud says if this guy that's walking towards them turned around and we never find out who it is, then nobody will be a Nazir. Now, Tama mishum dirtiya lachorav ha'atelekaman have Nazir. So now this must be a contrast. The reason why he's not a Nazir is because he walked away. Otherwise, if he came to us, he would be a Nazir. Maneh. So who is the author of this law in the Mishnah? Maneh ilema Rabbi Tarfon. So maybe maybe I'll say it's Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon is one in the Mishnah that said, any case of doubt, his person is not a Nazir. So according to Rabbi Tarfon, mi have a Nazir, even if he comes and he is Shimon, right? And I thought he was Shimon, and I made a vow, and he turns out he is Shimon. Rabbi Tarfon says, since you had some doubt, and it wasn't based on just 100%, therefore you're not a Nazir. So if I'm not a Nazir, even if it turns out to be Shimon, all the more so I'm not going to be a Nazir if he goes away. So you don't even have to say this, right? This opinion cannot be Rabbi Tarfon, because this opinion is assuming that he's only not a Nazir because he walked away. If he was here, he would be. All right. Now, we don't say this, but it also can't be Bet Shammai, because Bet Shammai says a person is a Nazir no matter what. Any case of doubt, even if it's an error, right? Even if I say, I think it's Shimon, and I make a vow dependent on that, it turns out not to be Shimon, so Bet Shammai says he's still a Nazir, right? Because and even an erroneous vow is a vow, so it can't be Bet Shammai either. So it would have to be someone within Bet Hillel, but the question is who within Bet Hillel would say that in the case of error, you would be lenient. So, okay. Kevan de b'shata de kanazar la yada'i pelonihu ve'ila michala ale nezirut. Okay, this is all explaining why it can't be Rabbi Tarfon, since at the time that he made the neder, he didn't know if this was the guy or not. So now he should be a Nazir because he doesn't know. According to the Rabbi Tarfon, even if I know who he is, even if he turns out to be who I thought he is, he's not a Nazir. Can't be Rabbi Tarfon. והתניא, רבי יהודה אומר משום רבי טרפון, אין אחד מהם נזיר, לפי שלא ניתנה נזירות, אלא להפלאה. Here's the source for רבי טרפון. Right, Braita says, רבי יהודה teaches in the name of רבי טרפון, none of them are Nazirin. Why? Because Nazirut is only applies in Hafla'ah. The Pasuk says, right, Ki yafli lindor neder, regarding a Nazir, only if Hafla'ah means to do something very clearly. It comes from the same word as Pele, which means something wondrous. That itself comes from a root mean to separate from between one thing or another. So something that is wondrous is like so amazing that it's separate from that which is ordinary. And so here it would mean something that is so clear, it's like clear as day, clear as a miracle, that this person really is a Nazir. So any doubt at all, the person is not a Nazir according to the Rabbi Tarfon, and therefore Rabbi Tarfon says in no cases, even if it turns out he was right, still not a Nazir. Okay, so clearly not Rabbi Tarfon. Ela Rabbi Yehuda dichrihu. Detanya hareni Nazir almanat shehe bichri hazeh me'akor v'alach b'so shenignav o she'avad Rabbi Shimon oser v'Rabbi Yehuda matir. This Baraita, also a Tosefta that we have seen before, teaches if a person takes upon himself a Nazirut, he says, I'll be a Nazir on condition that in this heap of grain there's at least 100 kor. He's taking a bet with his friend. Look how big it is, right? And now they're going to go and check. And now when they go and check, it turns out that the heap was stolen or lost, and now they can't check anymore. There's no way to ever verify whether there had been in that pile more than 100 quarters, a big amount. So Rabbi Shimon says, well, if you're in doubt, it could be that there was. Therefore, you have to be stringent. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if you're in doubt, you can be lenient and assume that there was not, and a Nazirut, where there is a doubt and there's no way to verify it, then you're okay, you're off the hook. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda would be the opinion of the Mishnah, the anonymous opinion in the Mishnah that says a similar case. Person says, I think that's Shimon. He takes a vow and then he runs away. We don't know what it is. Well, it's a case of doubt. Rabbi Yehuda says, we give him the benefit of the doubt and he's not a Nazir. Rabbi Shimon is quoted in our Mishnah saying he has to take a double vow. Maybe it was Shimon. I'll be a Nazir obligatorily. Maybe it's not. I'll be a Nazir anyway, voluntarily. So that way I cover all bases. That is consistent with Rabbi Shimon here, as we explained. Rabbi Shimon savar kevan de ilu lo nignav dilma havu be me'akor v'ave nazir hashtamaname have nazir v'hachaname kevan de yata lekaman v'yadinan de ploni have nazir hashtaname have nazir. In the case of the heap of grain, since if it were not stolen, could be that there was in fact 100 kod or more, and then he would be a Nazir. So we have to worry about that possibility, and he has to be a Nazir. And so too in this case, since if the person had come and turns out that it was Piloni, and his condition was true, so he would be a Nazir. So now also, even though he ran away and we're not sure, but we have to worry about the doubt and assume that he is, and therefore he will be a Nazir. The Mishnah simply adds that, well, let him take upon himself a conditional added vow that if it turns out it was not, I'll be a Nazir anyway, and that way at the end he can shave, he can bring his korbanot, no matter what was the case before, he'll be a full and proper Nazir. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.